hello, and welcome once again to the Sage's Library. I am, as always, your humble sage, Trevor Devall. Thank you so much for joining me here today in the library. Today I have a very special treat for us all. Oh, this is the granddaddy of them all. This is where it all began, for me, in any event. This is the game that started everything that brought me to you here today. Today, we are going to be talking about the first edition AD&D Player's Handbook. That's right, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, first edition. This little baby came out in 1978, and I first got my hot little hands on it around 1979, 1980. I was very, very young, but I remember my very first introduction to role-playing games whatsoever was because of this book, and because of the module, The Village of Hamlet, which my friend Jason had run for me, and we rolled up a character using this book. I had no idea what that meant, rolling up a character. It was bizarre. What did that mean? And I rolled up a paladin because I liked this image. This was the image in the book that just completely put me into the world of fantasy role-playing. So I created a paladin, and I didn't know what to name him, because when the DM said to me, hey, what's his name? I thought, what do you mean, what's his name? And then it occurred to me, oh yes, this is a different character from me. And so, not knowing where to turn, we just stole one of the names from the module itself, Black J, and that was one of the NPCs in the book, which turned out to be my character, my main D&D character for years and years and years after that. So, AD&D Player's Handbook. Boy, where do you start with this one? I haven't actually played this game since the mid-'80s. D&D was sort of a gateway drug for us. We began with D&D because, of course, most people did back then, because that was the main thing, much as it is today. But around the mid-'80s, we decided that we wanted to expand our horizons a bit, and so we started into, well, all the other games you can see here represented in the Sage's Library. But it is amazing to me that we were able to figure this out at all. And as a lot of these games have illuminated, turns out we were playing these games wrong. Surprise, surprise. This one is no different. Gary Gygax, who was the author of this magnificent tome, had a very particular way of writing. You could call it Gygaxian, because that's what it was. It was... Let's just say that this book is based around complexity of rules, but with simplicity of purpose. If I had to describe this game in one phrase, it would be beautifully labyrinthine. Gary's vocabulary was out there. He used a lot of what we would consider archaic terminology. I loved it as a kid. But I mean, where else is an 8-year-old boy in the early 80s going to come across the term waghalter, which is a term for like a 4th level assassin, I think, and it means he who is about to be hanged. or looking at the weapon list and thinking, you know what, I'll have a sword and a guisarme volge, or however you pronounce that, which is a type of polearm. Gary did love his polearms. What are these things? But it didn't matter, because in the imagination of an 8-year-old boy, of course, it was tremendous. It was awesome. So I learned all kinds of very interesting words from reading Gary's writings in both this and in the Dungeon Master's Guide. He could be quite verbose and quite circuitous when it came to trying to make his point, and this is a perfect example of Gygaxian writing, because it is a labyrinth. You can't just crack this book open and say, okay, let's make a character and learn the game. It doesn't work that way with this game. This is a tome that you have to pore over like a sage in order to truly understand how it works. Today, we are treated to wonderfully organized games with clarity of rules and precision of editing. But back then, remember, this was the first time they had done this. This was, besides original D&D, or the first basic that had just come out right before this. For one thing, this game is written very much with the war gamer in mind. You have to remember, in 1978, role-playing didn't really exist, but wargaming did. And so Gary's audience, from, judging by how this book is written, Gary's audience was overwhelmingly wargaming mindset players. So they had intrinsic understanding of certain concepts that an 8-year-old boy did not. This idea of, well, of course you have a group of characters, and of course they're going to think tactically, and of course you're going to have your fighters in front with the second rank being guys with polearms, because that way you can get reach on your opponents when they come at you. This was all tactical thinking that was completely new, as was the whole notion of role-playing, completely new. So when you read this book with its inherent assumption that you just get it. It takes a lot more work to get through it. Obviously, we did the work and we got through it, and here we are, 40 years later. But it's just fascinating going back and looking at this dense tome, trying to figure out something basic like how do you run a combat? Because it's not clear. In fact, you can't do it using just this book. In current 5th edition, when you look at the combat section, it tells you exactly what happens. It says, this is how you run a fight. This is what a round is. These are the types of actions you can do. And it's a very, I don't want to say prohibitive list, but that's basically what it is. It basically says, these are the things you can do. Whereas in this book, in order to even understand how a fight works, you have to read like 3 different sections, all of which are walls of text. And if you're looking for particular rules, like how much can I move an attack in one round? Well, the answer is you can't. You can move 10 feet in a segment at attack, but the only way you'd know that is understanding what a segment means and looking at the surprise section. So it's all over the place. You have to comb through this thing. You have to read every part of this in order to understand. Now that is no necessarily bad thing, because what it did was that it forced young minds to really focus on this material in order to understand it. Nothing about this game was spoon-fed. Nothing about this game was easy. You had to really focus, and you had to learn. You had to learn new terminology. You had to learn new vocabulary. You had to know what the hell Gary was talking about if you just wanted to get into a fight. It really encouraged deep and thoughtful reading, which I gotta say, I don't have kids, but if I did, I would encourage them to read things like this, because you had to pay attention. You had to really dive into it. You couldn't just, half-ass it. You certainly couldn't go to the internet to get a Wikipedia summary of how the rules worked. No, you were on your own. It's fascinating. And it's of particular interest to me is the combat example in this book, because it's about like a dwarf and a cleric and a fighter and a magic user, I think, or something like that. And they encounter 30 orcs and an illusionist, and they gain surprise. Now, the combat example is 1 paragraph long, and it explains what's happening in the combat. They get surprised, and the fighter throws his axe, and then the illusionist, and then they get initiative, and so the orcs run up and spoil the wizard's spell that he was casting. They explain what's happening, they just don't explain how it's happening. So in order to understand the rules of this game, you had to go back and go, whoa, wait a minute, I think there's a rule about weapon speed in the equipment section that pertains to this thing that was originally mentioned in the movement rules, it's a workout, man. It's a workout for the brain. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, just a thing. They were trying to figure it out, and they were trying to organize their rules in the best way they knew how. Such was the way of things back then. Or movement rules. Movement rules, of course, were in inches. Well, if you don't understand wargaming terminology and you look at this book and he says, the character moves 12 inches, you think, 12 inches? The character moves like this in a combat round? And how long is a combat round? And what is a segment, by the way? And all of these things that just come up. Of course, 12 inches comes from the wargaming days when you moved 12 inches, you moved your figures 12 inches on the board. It equated to 120 feet, 1 inch was 10 feet, but you had to really pore over this thing to understand that. That might not even be in this book. That might be in the DMG. I don't know. What's interesting is that I haven't actually looked at this book since, I don't know. It's been probably 20 years since I even opened this book. But going through it now for this video, I discovered a bunch of gems in here that I didn't know existed, because I didn't apparently comb through it quite accurately enough. I discovered things like you can parry in this game. There it is, right there, in one little section. I don't think it's the combat section. Who knows? It's probably in the equipment section. But there's a moment where you can decide, instead of attacking, you can sort of back up and parry, which means if you have a strength score bonus, because that's what you use to hit, then you can actually apply that as a penalty to your opponent's attack against you. I didn't know you could do that. This is a treasure trove, man. Just like the DMG, I should do a video on the DMG alone, because the 1st edition Dungeon Master's Guide it's a trip. It's wild, because it's chock full of stuff that you just know is going to be useful if you can just get through it somehow. Of course, 1st edition is just like every other edition of D&D when it comes to its magic. It's Vancian, which means that the spellcasters have to pre-memorize their spells or pre-prepare their spells, and once the spell is cast, that's it. It's gone from the memory. I've always hated Vancian magic. That's the reason why I actually left D&D when I did. Well, it wasn't the only reason, but it was one of them. I never liked it. I liked other systems that did it better. But that's just a personal preference. The Vanity and Magic was pretty foundational to the game of D&D, and it has remained foundational pretty much through to the current day. Now, speaking of current day, I do want to talk a little bit about the differences in focus between this game and the current game, 5th edition. I don't have a huge amount of experience with 5th edition. I've played it, I've run a campaign, so, I understand it, I get it, obviously. But I will tell you this, the focus of this game was about player tactics as opposed to character abilities, and getting treasure as opposed to leveling up and becoming more inherently powerful. In D&D 5th edition, the characters are basically fantasy superheroes. What makes them special, quote unquote special or unique, in terms of what they can achieve in the world, in the game world, are almost all tied to their class features, their feats, their special abilities, their racial abilities, whatever the case is. It's all about the characters. The stuff they get in D&D 5e, it's kind of irrelevant. I mean, it exists, and yes, they're nice little toys, but really it's not that big a deal. And gold pieces in AD&D 5th we found to be like useless. Like, what do you even do with it? You don't need to buy anything. And you don't really gain any advantage from being rich. But in this game, it was all about the gold. The whole purpose of the game was going into the dungeon and pulling out the gold. That's how you got experience points. You also didn't have fancy class features. You were just a thief or a fighter. Yes, you had some inherent things like paladins could lay on hands and heal people. And there was, everybody had some sort of an inherent thing. But a 5th level fighter in this game, if you got two 5th level 1st edition fighters, class-wise, they're going to look pretty much exactly the same. What's going to distinguish them apart, or what's going to differentiate those two fighters, is the stuff that they have. And, of course, the tactics of the player controlling that character. Because in 5th edition, as I said before, there's all kinds of rules very, very explicitly laid out. This is what you can and cannot do. It reads more like a law book than a game book. That's not a knock on you 5th edition players or people who love it. Not at all. I'm just saying it's much different than this game, because this game is very much the trust your DM. This game is very much the player's tactics are way more important than what the character's special abilities are. So if there's a group of player characters in a dungeon, let's say, and they get flanked by a group of goblins coming out the side corridor, whatever, it's up to those players to immediately reform their position to get their magic users behind the second rank of spearmen or bowmen or whatever, while the fighters go up and engage them to give the thief enough time to hide in shadows. But none of that is explicitly laid out in the rules of what those characters can do. That's all player tactical thinking. So it's a very, very, very different focus, this game, than what 5th Ed is. As I said, 5th Ed is kind of a fantasy superhero game. This is, you're not really just a bunch of chumps going into a dungeon. You're still a superior type of person. Even Gary himself says that, every character should have at least 2 15s. Oh, by the way, this book doesn't even tell you how to roll stats. You have to go to the DMG for that. But even Gary would and did say that, the characters are superior to sort of normal mortals, but they are nothing compared to 5th edition characters. You take a 6th level fighter in 5th edition versus a 6th level fighter in this. Yeah, this guy, unless he's got like a +5 Vorpal sword or something, he's in big trouble. Basically, the focus of this game was still what a lot of old schoolers might call rulings over rules. So it was very much about the DM interpreting the situation and applying a temporary rule to just get you through the moment. And that's the way it was. You trust your DM. That was the way it was. And it worked out great. Sometimes it didn't. Of course, every system has its flaws, and every sort of philosophy of gaming has its flaws. But that's the way 1st Ed was. Now, what's interesting is that there's a bunch of retro clones that seek to reproduce this game, as well as other versions of D&D. I think the two that, for me, come closest to sort of getting this right are Osric, which stands for Old School Renaissance Inspired something compendium, maybe, and Axe, which is Adventure, Conquer, and King. Now, what is interesting about those two retro clones is that, in my opinion, they kind of do what this game tries to do better than this game does it. And that's mostly a matter of organization. The rules for this game are all in here. You just gotta really fight to find them. So what these other retro clone games have done is basically take the heart and spirit of this game, along with some of the actual rules, and just organize them and package them a little bit better so that you can get through it quicker and easier. You can get to the end game of having super powerful characters, what they used to call name level characters. Fighters who are 9th level and above, who can build a fortress, and clerics who can build a temple, and thieves who can establish a thieves guild and all that stuff. Well, there are rules for all of that in AD&D, not in this book, but in the DMG. But they're really Byzantine. They're really, really difficult to get through. Those retro clones look at that and say, okay, how can we replicate the experience of what AD&D was attempting to do, and still keeping the basic structure of the rules, but explaining it much, much clearer. So if you're interested in AD&D, by all means, go and check out the original system. I mean, I encourage everybody to have a look at these books. They're artifacts of our history. They're artifacts of our past, and they still have a lot of gold in them, a lot of gold pieces to gain experience points in them. But you should also check out those games, Osric and Axe and some of the other ones, just to see how a modern mindset applied to these old rules brings out the best of what these rules were trying to do. So fascinating stuff. Long story short, AD&D and all the D&Ds will have a hallowed place on these shelves. They're foundational. I mean, this was the granddaddy of them all. This is the one that started everything for me. So although I will probably never play this game again or run it, just because there's so many options now, I will always have a fondness in my heart when I look at this and I crack open this book and I smell the glue that still smells the same today as it did back in 1978. Oh, it just sends me right back. It'll always have a special place in my heart and in my library. So that's the AD&D Player's Handbook. Thanks for joining me. And if you want to help support what I'm doing here on Me, Myself, and Die, you can like and subscribe, or if you want to join us on Patreon to help support the show, you can do that too. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time on the next Sage's Library.